The Strategic Petroleum Reserve has gotten a lot of conversations going over the last couple of years, with many people declaring that it's been run disastrously or ineffectively, and that we are now on the verge of a crisis for how bad it has been managed. I'm going to tell you why I think that is the wrong way to look at it. And I'm going to tell you why I think it actually may be one of the best run government programs in history. Now, before I go too far, I'm not saying it's been run perfectly, and I'm not saying that there's not problems. And I would also say that being the best run government program in history is not a particularly high bar to jump over. But I do think it's important to understand why we have it to begin with, why it was created, and what it has effectively done over the last 50 years, and specifically over the last 10 or 15 years. So let's take a look at some of these slides that I put together. Um, if you look here, and this isn't something that I have just started talking about recently. I was certainly no fan of Biden's, but I even said when he was using it back in 2023 and 2024 that it was being used appropriately. So this is not something that I just kind of came up with to justify how things are going in Iran. And I said, back in 23 that my unpopular opinion was that Biden's use of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was exactly why it was created to begin with. And several times over the last couple of years, as oil has, priced lower along the way, I've said perhaps Biden was a better oil trader than many people gave him credit for at the time. So again, this isn't something that I just now came up with. But the other thing is I think a lot of people are under the impression it was only supposed to be used in a war or in a very, very severe crisis situation from a military perspective. Now, the first thing I would say with regard to that is if we are in a war with Iran now, it would be appropriate to use it. But again, war was not the reason that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was created. In fact, for several decades, the U.S. military had its own Strategic Petroleum Reserve that was managed via a different program. And the SPR was then, and it is now, a means to counter unexpected supply disruptions and how it would affect economic actions, not military actions. But, I guess you really kind of got to go all the way back to the beginning. And it was started like 51 years ago, back in 1975. And it was built exactly for the reasons and the type of supply shocks that we have faced twice in the last 5 or 6 years. And both times it has been used in the last 5 or 6 years, it has worked pretty well. But it all started, back in 1975 after the Arab oil embargo of 1973. Congress passed a law that created the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And, at the peak, it had 714 million barrels of authorized capacity. And they're basically in these salt caverns down along the southern Gulf Coast. And over the years, over that 51 years, it's been tapped 6 different times, or 6 different major times that it's been tapped. And, going all the way back to the Gulf War in the early 2000s up until now with Iran. So this is exactly what it was built for. But it was built out of a crisis. First, there was a shock, and then came the plan. But as I said, in 1973, there was this Arab oil embargo. This started as a result of the Yom Kippur War. The United States supported Israel in that. The Arabs didn't like that the United States supported Israel in that, and so they used oil as a weapon and embargoed oil shipments to the United States. And that caused the price of oil to go from, the price of a barrel of oil to go from $3 to $12 over a year. And so, the law was passed in 1975. The first oil started to get delivered to these caverns in 1977. And that the average price of the oil in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is below $30. I think it's like $29.70 or high 20s when they started filling up this oil reserve. But the pain of that embargo was so great, and the economic and political capital that was spent as a result of that embargo is what caused this to be built in the first place. It tipped the country into its worst recession since the war. It pushed inflation, up to 12%. We had 9% unemployment. The stock market basically got cut in half over that period of time. And gas lines, people were waiting in line for miles to get gas. That caused Richard Nixon, who was already unpopular because of everything going on with Watergate, to come under even more political pressure. And ultimately, he resigned due to Watergate. But part of the reason he was so unpopular was not just Watergate, but because of the economic problems as a result of this oil embargo. So again, this whole SPR was built as a result of an immense amount of pain that the United States was going through. So they didn't ever want to go through that again. But again, to be clear, this is not for military purposes. It was for an economic reason, and for a political reason. Long before they ever created this SPR in 1975, the Navy had its own Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Both Elk Hills and Teapot Dome were created all the way back over 100 years ago, and that was basically to guarantee fuel for warships as as it would be needed. And so the fact that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve came along in the 70s, that's 60, 70 years after the military created one for exactly the same reason. So again, this was for the economy. It wasn't for the military. And the United States already had one going all the way back to 1912 for the military. And really, if we look at price of oil, so this chart up on the top right, this is a chart of both oil and gasoline, and it's got dual axes, but the crude oil is on the left, price of gasoline's on the right, but they track each other very closely. And a barrel of oil like I said, in 1970 was $3, and it became 12 after the crisis. The highest oil ever went was back in 2008 at $140. It got close again a couple months ago, but it didn't quite get there. But that's more than 40 times the price of the price of oil back in the 70s. And the price of average price of a gallon of gasoline in the United States got to about $5 a couple years ago when Russia invaded Ukraine, and it's back close to that now. I think it's around 4, a little over 4. But the point is that if you look at this chart, you can see that basically oil went sideways from about 1980 to early 2000s. Then it had a big gap up from the early 2000s to about 2008. And then it's really gone sideways. It's basically where it was back in 2008, or earlier this year, it was back where it was in 2008, but spent most of the previous 15 years below where it was in 2008. Part of the reason oil price moved up so much in the early 2000s was one, the lowering of interest rates coming out of the dot-com crisis. Greenspan held rates low for a long time, but also the huge growth in China. China became much more of an industrial power than they had been in the previous 20 years. And the energy needed to power that expansion was large. Also, the growth of just the emerging markets, non-China, was a big deal. But just, and also the fact that, we talked a little bit about, the price of oil has to remain within a band. We've talked about that on previous episodes. But when price of oil was lower, it caused a lack of investment in the area, in the industry. And so then when the demand showed up, the supply wasn't there. But long story short, with the exception of 2001 to 2008, oil has really gone sideways for much of that last 20, 30, 40 years. Anyway, let's keep going forward here. But since the SPR was created, it's been tapped 6 times. Now, the first one was the Gulf War in the early 90s, again in Hurricane Katrina, again Hurricane Gustav and Ike. We did it in early 2011 or 12 with the Arab Spring, again when Russia invaded Ukraine, and now again with Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. But what I want to point out is, despite these huge supply shocks going back to Russia in 2022 and Iran this year, again, if you look at the price of oil, it stayed low despite all of those things. And that is the reason the SPR was created. Most everybody back in 2022, the trade that everybody was absolutely certain of was that Russia was going to restrict the price of energy, or the flow of energy. That was going to cause both natural gas and oil to go into much higher than it was. And yet it didn't happen. And again, with the Iran war, now many people said price of energy is going to skyrocket. and it just hasn't. They've done a good job of using the SPR to soften that burden. And again, if you don't think that's what it's supposed to be used for, then what is it supposed to be used for? Right? Again, 1991, they used it for the Gulf War. That's kind of the first big time that it was used. And then it's been tapped several times since then. But it can release up to 4.4 million barrels a day, which is a roughly third of U.S. output, if it's really humming. And so that's kind of how often it's been used and why it's been used and how effective so far it has been used. Now, if you look at this chart, it kind of shows the buildup of the SPR, and then it shows it going sideways for 20, 30, 40 years, and then the pretty big drawdown now over the last, call it 10 or 15 years. But I've kind of plotted on this chart here where the different emergencies are. But the point is whenever you've seen these emergencies, the whole point is if without the SPR, those emergencies dots would show the beginning of a spike. But rather than a beginning of a spike, it's either just gone sideways or down. So again, that is what it's created for. Now, you might not think that it's a serious enough crisis to warrant tapping the SPR, but again, that is what the SPR is for. So what's the point of having a strategic petroleum reserve if you're not going to use it? And so far, every time it's been used, it has at least so far enabled the United States to avoid a nasty recession, such as the one in 1973. Anyway, we can kind of keep going forward here. But this time now, this is obviously the biggest test, not only because it's the biggest issue and it's kind of going on for the longest period of time, but it's also being done when the inventory is already at a lower level than it was on the previous episodes. And so for 6 months now, they've been releasing 1 million barrels a day. And that is, oil's like at $85 now. So again, it's avoided the catastrophic disaster that many people have expected. I think the high for WTI was in the low 120s earlier this year. And this is the first time that there has been a supply shock of this magnitude. And it's not just the United States who has used its reserves. Many other countries around the world have used their reserves to buffer this supply constraint as well. The other thing I would say is I think many people don't realize when the oil has been tapped, and I'm specifically going to talk about 2022 now, because Biden got a lot of criticism when he was using it back in 22. But the oil was sold at an average price of $95 when that was sold. The price is $85 now. So if you're just looking at a pure monetary perspective, it's in a profit. You sold it at 95 and it's now at 85. That's a pretty good trade. And not only that, but it got as low as 50 or 60. Now, I know some people are saying, well, they should have refilled it at 50 or 60 or even 70. Sure, I think they probably should have. But my point is as of now, and this could change, and we'll talk about a little bit how it could change, but as of now, it has worked. And not only that, but there was a time in 2024, I think, where the Biden administration bought back a little bit. They didn't buy back a lot, but they sold it around 95 and started buying some back and canceled other sales when it was around 75. So again, I'm no fan of Biden, and it's hard to say that he was the guy making the decisions. But whoever was making the decisions, it has worked so far. But now here, let's take a harder look at the Strait of Hormuz here, right? Again, the war kicked off in February or late February, early March of 2026, and we started drawing on the reserves again. But this is what it's built for, and so 90 million barrels have been released in 2026, and the worry is that even more could be released, and we could deplete. The reserves. There's 28 other countries that have also done it. The last time that it was this low actually was 1983, shortly after when it was first being built up. So we are getting back to kind of critical levels. But again, so far, I think it has done what it was supposed to do. The other reason why I don't think it's as a big a deal now, and I'm not saying it's not important. I want to be clear. I'm not saying that this isn't important. I'm not saying we shouldn't rebuild the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. I'm just saying if I step back and look at it objectively, why was it created? What was it supposed to be used for? And now that it has been used, what are the results? It's worked pretty good. And part of the reason that I think it's not as important, I'm not saying it's not important, relative, it's not as important as it was back in the 70s, is because America is much different than it was then. We're the top energy producer in the world now. Back in then, we were very reliant on Mid East oil. That's not true to the same extent today. Today, the United States produces more crude oil than any nation ever has, and the Gulf Coast refiners, we can run. They can refine the heavy crude that now comes from Venezuela. So not only are we producing our own oil, but now that we have access to Venezuelan oil that can be refined on the southern coast, the likelihood of a supply shock hurting the United States more than it hurts the rest of the world is much lower. But the United States, we're at like 13.6 million barrels pumped a day. Russia's less than 10, and so is Saudi Arabia. So, we're 40% higher than the next two biggest producers. So that has an effect on the calculus of whether it is still needed to the same extent. Now, again, I'm not saying it's not needed. I just don't know that it's needed to the same extent as it was back in 1975. And the other thing is, we've talked about these other countries. Now, China has done a very good job. They did a very good job of building up their strategic petroleum reserve prior to this crisis. They now have the biggest strategic petroleum reserve in the world. But the other thing I would say is, do you really trust these numbers? Now, you might say, don't trust the United States numbers. That's fine. I'm with you. We can be very skeptical of the United States numbers. But if you're going to question the United States numbers, then you've got to question China's numbers. The other thing is China's imports have fallen dramatically. And so if their imports are falling dramatically, but their economy has not cratered, then that means they are using energy from somewhere else. They're probably pulling it from their strategic petroleum reserve. So let me ask you, why is it okay for China to tap their strategic petroleum reserve when there's a supply shock, but it's not okay for the United States to tap its strategic petroleum reserve when there's a supply shock? In other words, I think both countries planned for this potential supply shock, and both are using their strategic petroleum reserves as intended in the situation intended in order not to be hurt economically. Now, perhaps this is going to change. Perhaps this is still going to get away from them. Perhaps oil is still going to go to $150 or $200. But as of right now, both the United States and China have done a pretty good job of insulating themselves from this crisis that many people have predicted would be a disaster. So I think, just the overall verdict from my perspective is this is a program that has worked. We've had 50 years of it, 6 different emergencies. The reserves did what they were designed to do. It softened the 2 real supply shocks of the last 5 years, and it has kept the United States out of recession, and the trades were done at a profit. Now, what is still uncertain is what goes on from here. Are we ever going to be able to fill it back up? Do we need to fill it back up now that we're a bigger producer? Are there going to be more supply shocks that are going to cause the inventories that have already been drawn to be completely depleted? This we don't know. And listen, I am open. And I think not only is it possible, but it's probably likely that these reserves will hit even more critically low levels and that we will have some issues as a result of it. But we don't know yet. The point is, as of now, we just don't know. And as of now, it has worked. And while the future is never certain, the strategic reserves that exist have been used in these months for the exact reasons that they were created 50 years ago. And a reserve that you never touch is just an expensive storage. So if reserves are bought in order to be used, then I think that they have been used appropriately. Now, that's my take on it. You guys might feel differently. And maybe 6 months from now or a year from now, this crisis will have gotten worse and we will have to take another look at this. But as of now, that's my take on the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. I think it's important to look at it that way. And while I'm no big fan of government programs, on a relative basis, this government program seems to have worked pretty well. And perhaps it's even the best organized and best run and best managed government plan that I've seen in my career. So anyway, if you like this type of topic and if you like thinking about these type of geopolitical issues and how they interact with the financial world, go over to research.santiagocapital.com, sign up, take a look at our different offerings. Also hit subscribe and like on this. And we will be back next week with another edition of Milkshakes, Markets, and Madness. Have a good one.